الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا فمن يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ثم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. I want to thank everyone for tuning in this evening, late at night, early morning, for what has become something of a tradition of ours now. And mashallah, we've been doing these hangouts, and they are intended as very informal sessions where we can talk about everything from classical texts to contemporary issues. This morning, I have the honor of having Mohammed Safi, who I met many years ago in Cairo as Tayssir. And that's actually what I want to ask him about first. This was, mashallah, when I met him, he was living in Garden City in Cairo with a mutual friend of ours, John Halliwell. With a mutual friend of ours, John Halliwell. And you were studying Arabic at that time, correct?
Yeah.
But you were still attending the University of Michigan, correct?
No, I had finished, Salam alaikum, first of all, to everyone. I had finished undergrad in 2006. And then out of the encouragement of Dr. Jackson and others, I did CASA for a year, was at the American University when it was still in Tahrir near Garden City. And then I met you, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, after I just finished that year. So I just finished a year at CASA, and I was doing private Arabic and Islamic studies. And that's when I met you and Sheikh Hamza Abdul Malik and that group.
MashaAllah. But at that time, you hadn't declared your interest in kind of the religious calling, if you will. I still remember you being somewhat undetermined about what was next.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So actually now being in Turkey, a protracted course of study, the traditional ulum, how did this, just give me some sense of how this came about, man.
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can fully understand how it all came to be, but originally I was planning to do something, I would say, like you said, I wasn't really certain. I was probably going to go like the Islamic law kind of route. But I was thinking much more of an academic route, and academic kind of in the Western academy sense. But then I think while I was in Egypt, I kind of started to feel like maybe that wasn't right for me. I wanted to do something more, at the time I would have used the word traditional. And I wanted to do something more, I think, practical on the ground with people, which is all ironic, by the way, of where I ended up. But nevertheless, that's how it played out. And so I spent a few years more abroad studying with shuyukh. And then I came back to Michigan, and I worked as a youth director for like 3 or 4 years at MCWS, which is a suburb of Detroit in Canton. And then I worked as a chaplain for about 4.5 years at the University of Michigan. And all the time I kind of continued studying with shuyukh online and in America. And then I really felt kind of the need to study Islamic sciences in kind of a more rigorous way. Particularly what they call kind of the rational sciences. So I moved to Istanbul, and I've been doing that for the last 4 years, both with shuyukh privately at a university here, and then through some institutes. There's a lot of institutes here. So I've kind of been uniting between those three methods.
MashaAllah, barakallahu feek. And I understand that you've also picked up a good amount of Turkish.
Yeah, I mean, that's debatable. My wife, who's part Turkish, she might not agree with that, but I think I picked up enough Turkish to get by.
More than a smattering.
Yeah. No. I mean, I have to have up to a certain amount in order to get through the university. So, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. And why Turkey, man? I mean, this tradition, because I want to say something about this just briefly. This tradition of going abroad to study. This is an ancient tradition, the rihla, traveling, in search of knowledge. And you hear differing perspectives about traveling for knowledge. some people say traveling for knowledge heightens the disconnect between the teacher and the environment that he or she comes from and will be teaching in eventually. So people who come back from overseas that just lack, I wouldn't even say context, because that's something a person could sit down and give you, over a good cup of coffee, right? Well, this is kind of what's going on. This is what people are talking about. But they lack that inherent connection to the environment, so that they have a difficult time recalibrating to feel what the people that they're attempting to minister to are feeling, right? And then other people say, without the rihla, without traveling in search of knowledge, one becomes closed-minded. One almost becomes
tunnel vision.
Tunnel vision. You become narrow-minded. You become too accustomed to the conventions and kind of normalities that shape your own limited kind of subjective experience. So how have you found why Turkey? How have you found Turkey?
Yeah, well, in terms of why Turkey, because there were some professors and shuyukh here that I wanted to work with, and I was visiting them. My wife's from Cyprus, so in order to get to northern Cyprus, which is an old political situation itself, you have to go through Istanbul. So I would come here, I'd spend a few days, I met a lot of people that way. And then I actually would come when I would visit my wife's family. We'd even spend one time we spent 3 months, and I just spent time studying. So I met people here that I wanted to work with. And I noticed that this particular city historically and currently has a focus in terms of the scholarship on certain sciences more than others. So it's probably one of the better places to go to focus on the disciplines that I wanted to focus on. And so I think that was one of the reasons. And I was attracted to the city. I mean, the city, you've been here. It's an extremely attractive city aesthetically, and it has a deep history Islamically. And I've traveled to a lot of different Muslim kind of civilizational places of learning. And so I think also the diversity, although I haven't gotten as much as I'd want, it is very useful to a person in their travels and in their studies. You study in Yemen, you study in Syria, you study in Egypt, you study in Jordan, you get kind of the different vibes, the different focuses. That's also extremely useful. In terms of the other questions that you asked, I think they're very important. And I think there's truth to all of them. Definitely a person can seclude themselves in a way that will disconnect them from the people that they're going to either teach or minister to, because that's another important variable. What does the person want to do? Like if you want to be, an imam, there are different skills and things you need to learn than if you want to be, for example, a madrasa instructor, than if you want to be a professor, so it really just depends also what the person wants to do. And our mutual friend, Sheikh Hamza Abdul Malik, I remember he used to tell me, and I don't want to, divulge anything that he might not want to divulge, but he used to tell me that he was very aware of this question. He was very worried about it and would think about it, about how do we keep at the forefront salient in our minds that we don't want to disconnect from people that we eventually want to interact with. So I try to stay connected. I travel to America quite a lot. I mean, also Istanbul is a major metropolitan city. It's not,
sure. Yeah,
you've been here. It's like an enormous place. So I'm still very, I feel like connected. But that being said, I'll say one last thing. My studies are extremely philosophical in nature. So that does kind of put your head kind of in the clouds. So that part, I think it's important that a person talks to people regularly so that they can kind of get pulled back into the real world and what impacts people. So I do think that's an important aspect.
MashaAllah. I am interested in this conversation primarily because there is a long-standing tradition of what I would call the exilic intellectual, right? How one attempting to treat or diagnose, problems within a given context sees those problems from without. Because sometimes I think being in the US, being very close, being in a sense, I won't say limited, but, all of our responses are contextualized by a certain kind of immediacy. You know, it's like, how is this relevant? Right. How does this address questions, real issues that people are dealing with? And sometimes in that immediacy, even though it's absolutely necessary, we might miss the bigger picture, or we might miss something. So I know how things look to me being here. I just wrote, you know, a little small article that I entitled "Riotous," you know, talking about, you know, some of what I saw in the wake of, you know, the protest that followed the police killing of George Floyd. But this moment of kind of radical reimagining that you see taking place in the U.S. now, I mean, how does this look from Istanbul?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer. It looks very intense, and it unfortunately doesn't. It's not surprising, unfortunately. You know, the murder of George Floyd, the murder of so many countless other people, unfortunately, is not surprising. You know, you know, watching it all unfold, watching what's happening in America unfold. You know, I do feel a certain sense of real connection to what's happening. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm an American. You know, I spent my entire life basically in America, apart from the times that I was studying abroad. So I do feel very connected. The question you asked about, though, that's basically like my area. So like I'm most interested in how kind of ideas impact one another, and how we need to kind of analyze things, and how those ideas impact how we act. And so, for example, I'll just give you one example. So one of the professors that I came to study for, like I came to Istanbul for, I remember when I was a chaplain, I was dealing with different ideas, different issues. So I came one time to meet with him, and I had like a list of questions. So I started asking him. So he just looks at me and he just goes, you know, this question is not a question you could just ask somebody like on the spot. This is a question that you need like experts and panels to research, so that they can come up with an idea about how to move forward. You know, this isn't like, Sheikh, can you answer this question for me?
Right.
So I think that's a little bit of what's happening. However, I will have one caveat, which is, personally, I'm of the opinion that we always got to work together. So having people that are on the ground and just doing what they need to do is also important, that you work with people who are working in kind of the intellectual world, people working on the ground, experts from different disciplines. I don't think you can go wrong by having more minds at the table to kind of discuss. But I do feel like, unfortunately, this is, you know, my own opinion, I do feel like, unfortunately, the Muslim community worldwide, and definitely in the United States, we don't take seriously, you know, the impact of ideas, and the impact of how to analyze things at a theory level and intellectual from within the community, from within the tradition. I think we take it seriously outside of the tradition. We all do. We go to universities, we get degrees, etc. Then we don't take seriously, well, how does this all synthesize with our religion and our intellectual tradition and our religion?
So name for me, I'm just, you know, right now you're talking to an ALIM audience, mashallah, and we pride ourselves on, you know, producing content that critical, analytical people enjoy. Because, you know, one of the, I think, fundamentals of ALIM, and this has been a fundamental since our inception, is that we want to empower the community. Now, empowerment, you know, this is a term that many neo-traditionals hate. They hate the term empowerment, right? Tamkeen, right? In Arabic, they hate the term empowerment because they feel that
you're having a double trouble, empowerment and tamkeen.
No. You know, because the idea is that we need to be producing people that know how to defer to the tradition, know how to defer to those that have inherited the mantle of the masters of the tradition. And there certainly is some, you know, merit to that when you talk about preserving the tradition. However, in a community that prides itself on literacy, prides itself on critical engagement with almost everything, I feel that we have no choice but to, lay our projects intellectually before the community, allowing them to weigh in. So for you, as someone studying philosophy, studying thought broadly, what's one of the most, I guess, relevant ideas, tensions, folky that what's something you're thinking about?
Yeah, I love the way that you set it up. And I basically agree with everything that you're saying. I think everything you're saying, maybe I'll add a couple things and I'll talk about some of those examples. I think the first step that I would ask is, well, what is the tradition? I think that is actually a very difficult question to answer, but I've been thinking about it for the last 4 years. And where I am so far is not really a definition, but it's maybe a list of things that I think it is. So number one, it's revealed scripture. It's Quran, the major books of hadith. That's, I think, a no-brainer. Beyond that, it's a certain set of central texts. I think that's important. There are like central texts in our tradition that really played a very, very important role. And they're kind of the backbone of what the ulama did. They're not that many, but they're there. Beyond that, I think it's a certain set of disciplines, and those disciplines created theories and axioms about how to interpret texts and how to deal with our religious texts. And then one step more is that it's the ulama through the last 1400 years, from as west as we can go to as east as we can go, as north as we can go, as south as we can go, trying to apply those theories, apply those texts in their contexts. Now that bottom level, that kind of, the application, it's not binding necessarily, right? It's like precedent, right? So depending on how often, how unanimous, et cetera, it'll play different roles. So it's not that just because in Bosnia, the ulama did things one way, then that's part of the tradition, therefore we're bound by it. But the revealed scripture, the general axioms, all of that is what I would consider the tradition. And if we're going to, for example, if we're going to apply that in our day and age, we have to think within that broad framework, right? And if we're going to overturn something, it's not impossible, but you need to give it its due, right? If something's going to be overturned, there's got to be a lot of need for it. And I think somebody who approaches the world from a non-traditional lens is going to say, who cares what they said in the past? Who cares what the ulama said, for the last 1400 years? I'm going to approach it from this vantage point, right? So I think that's kind of I think that distinction is important, right? Because I think for me, to answer your actual question, I have no problem with people who are not trained engaging in the questions. I just think that if we can agree that it's important that we keep in mind what Revelation says, what some of these core historical ideas and axioms that have been embraced are, and we engage with it. There's not like, you don't have to, other than Allah's word and the Prophet ﷺ's word that we're certain is his, you can you tug and pull, and that's fine.
Sure.
So I'm okay with that. In terms of the last question that you asked, the one that you asked right before I started talking, I think it's all the same issues that to me, I don't think there are important issues people don't know about. I think the issues that people are talking about are important issues. So whether it's race or it's gender or it's sexuality or it's politics, I think these things are incredibly important. The one thing that I think I'm interested in that might not be on people's tongues is these questions are important. How do we synthesize these fields with the tradition so that we can come up with answers that make sense in our day and age? Right? I think that's the way that I phrase all of these things. The Islamic intellectual tradition is extremely vibrant, but we've been stuck for a while. How do we think about politics and political theory? How do we think about social theory? How do we think about critical theory, postmodernism, modernism? How do we think about these things from within the tradition? How do we engage these ideas with the tradition, right? Rather than just saying, well, this isn't the tradition. I think that's a huge mistake.
No, I tend to agree with you. I think, anyone who thinks about Islamic intellectual history in this kind of Fukuyamian kind of end of history and the last man. Remember that book by Francis Fukuyama? And it talks about secular democratic politics and laissez-faire economics being kind of the end of the road in terms of both, economic and political theory in terms of a Western European trajectory. Like after this, it doesn't go in, there's nowhere else that we can go in terms of significant intellectual movements. Muslims have never subscribed to a notion like that. There's always somewhere else to go. In fact, I would even argue there is an absolute necessity that we continue moving, right? Tradition is living. Tradition is not frozen. They say that there's a difference between tradition and traditionalism. They say that traditionalism is the dead faith of the living in imitation of the dead. But tradition is the living faith of the dead. You see? Meaning, yes, we are bound intellectually by precedent, but we are not limited by precedent. We're still thinking about these issues, and we have a responsibility, in fact, to think about these issues. Now, I see that there was a question from Nora.
Did you want me to read it, or did?
Yeah, Bismillah, you can read it.
Who decides what to use from the tradition? What if a 13th century medieval male mufassir's view are used versus the lyrics of a hip hop artist who uses the music for social justice using Quran? It's a good question.
Bismillah, what do you think?
Well, I think based upon what I was trying to say earlier was to try to kind of get ahead of a question like that, right? Which is that the tradition is a process, right? It's a process of how to engage texts, how to process texts, how do you choose between various opinions. It isn't like a machine where you put something in and you only get one thing out, but there are boundaries, right? There are boundaries. For example, let's just take a real obvious example. There are rules to language, right? So if you look at a word and you say, well, I think this word means this. I think the word car means baseball bat. Person will say, no, that it doesn't work. You can't interpret it that way, right? Because there are rules to what that word means in English, and that's not one of its meanings. So there are boundaries. It's not like a total free-for-all, right? However, that being said, there's tension within interpretation. There always is. And as long as a person wants to work from within the tradition, a person learns to the best of their ability what those boundaries are, how to process those things. That's why I think it's extremely important. And that's why I personally see myself as working from within the tradition, that any of these questions that we talk about, we always have people who are experts within these fields from within the tradition, engaging with people who are experts in these other fields. So if we're going to talk about issues that have to do with, social theory, political theory, anthropology, any field really, that you team up experts from within the religious sciences with them so that we can kind of navigate these things together, as opposed to putting everyone at loggerheads with one another.
No, I agree. Now I'm gonna take an interesting approach to the question. I don't know if this question was asked by Sheikh Ustadh Noura Zeki. I don't know, but it could be. Seems like a question that she might ask, but it might be a different Noura, mashallah. But even in the way the question was posed, she mentioned that the scholar was 13th century, male, and medieval. So you really see that there is an attempt to historicize, not to devalue the opinion of a 13th century male medieval scholar, but saying that we have to historicize the opinions of that scholar, and that scholar's access to universal truth might be limited by the fact that he's in the 13th century, might be limited by the fact that he's living in the medieval period, might be limited by the fact that he's male. This approach to truth has a decidedly postmodern ring to it. What do you do with that, right? When we have traditional precedents like al-ibra bi-umum al-lafz wa laysa bi khusus al-sabab. Now, this is something we apply to revelation. This is not applied to the opinion. Oh, that statement that I just said, that consideration is given to the generality of what the words mean, not the specific circumstances that gave rise to their being uttered. They gave rise to those words being used, right? My point is, as a community that believes in truth that is accessible to people, right? Trans-historical truth, trans-identitarian truth. How do we validate that belief in absolute truth in a context as shaped by critical theory and other postmodern approaches to knowledge and epistemology as our own? I can't answer that question. You answer the question.
So I think also the second question is partially related, although it's different, but it's not far off. So I'm going to read the second question and I'll get to yours. Off of the question, what has caused our minimizing the tradition to only coming from certain regions? And how do we start to diversify our idea of tradition from many regions, i.e. the traditions from Islam in China, West Africa, etc.? More accurately, has the tradition been minimized to specific regions? And if so, how do we get, I think, or how do we set to diversifying the idea of tradition? So I think everything that's being mentioned, from the way that you posed it, Sheikh Ubaydullah, to what has been mentioned in both posts, I think is very fair. In terms of, do variables of our context impact how we process information? Of course they do, right? Of course. But the assumption is that the tradition doesn't have tools to try to check that. And I would argue that the tradition does have tools to try to check that. It's not perfect, but it does. Built within the tradition is ways to check those type of biases that don't always work, but there are there. And the disciplines are different, right? In other words, if you talk about a book of theology, you're dealing really with, very specific rational arguments. So there definitely is a possibility for bias. But it's different than when you're talking about laws for society. There's more opportunity for context to play a role. I'm not saying the other one doesn't have any ability, but it's different, right? Arabic language is different. Like if your tradition's part about it is Arabic language, the role of these things in Arabic language is not going to be anywhere near as big, right? So also we have to talk about the disciplines different, So I would say that instead of rejecting these types of critiques, is to figure out a way to include these types of variables within our discussions about the tradition. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? As long as we continue to hold sacred what is sacred, right? Revelation is sacred. Quran, the Sunnah, things that are clearly part of the religion are sacred, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't introduce certain critical apparatuses within the tradition to talk about things that maybe weren't highlighted as much. Like for me, I see the tradition as a living tradition, right? And so even these ideas that like critical theory, postmodernism, these things that they're somehow gonna yank the rug from under and flip everything on its head. I don't agree with that. First of all, the way that critical theory is applied is different in different contexts and different people. So what's to stop from Muslims having a critical theory within their tradition, or critical tools and apparatuses within their tradition, to engage certain questions that maybe weren't engaged as often? But to the other question that was related about, I don't know what to call it, maybe the global part of the religion. I think that's very important, right? Whether we're talking about West Africa or as far east, as you said, as China, as far north, as Bosnia, right? And as far south as we can go, right? I do think it's important to look at the lay of the land. But again, if you look at the disciplines, some of that already is there. Maybe in certain disciplines, not as much, but in certain disciplines, it's there, right? It's already there. So I think there's also an assumption. There's an assumption that there isn't a diversity of thought, right? So we have to look, is there? That's the first step. The first step is to see, is there a diversity? Is there an issue? Is there a problem? If it's there, then of course we should be looking at what they're saying in different regions, right? But I also feel like we have to be careful of just assuming that's what's happening, right? Because, for example, within our classes, whether it's theology or law, it's very normal, and Sheikh Ubaydullah can tell you, it's very normal for the author to be from all different parts of the globe. It's totally normal. It doesn't have to be from like the central lands of that we're all used to, Baghdad or Damascus or the Hijaz. It's not like that, right? So I think we have to take into consideration that there already is some diversity, but we should always be looking to increase it.
It's a very, very important point you raised, just about even assuming that these modern interpretive approaches are always diametrically opposed to Islam and tradition. I feel like that is just a very simple and binary way of seeing the world, but acknowledging some of the tensions, I think is very important. I think it's important to acknowledge that there is some tension, and I'm going to, push back a little bit on a point you raised. What I see within the tradition, especially with regard to law, because my background is in law, is that the maqasid, or the idea of the law having certain objectives, the law having clearly discernible objectives. These are the values, the normative values that Islamic law seeks to promote. And if we see the application of a practice or the application of a law or a ruling actually contravening those principles, then we have to, look again, right? We have to, because we actually have something of a results-based, approach. My issue with some critical approaches is that rather than just looking at the results, there's often an attempt to impute certain motives. There are large contextual kind of readings of whole situations that sometimes prove themselves to be highly inaccurate. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. So speaking of our good mutual friend, Sheikh Hamza Abdul Malik, this was something that I shared with him. We were studying a book of hadith at Azhar called Fath al-Mubdi, and we came to this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which some of the newly converted Ethiopians of Banu Arqidah, they were yarqusun fi Masjid al-Nabawi. They were like dancing. They were like doing some choreographed kind of presentation on Eid, and they were saying, Muhammadun nafsun tayyibah. Muhammad is a pure soul. And many things happened, within this hadith. But what I want to focus on is that Aisha radiallahu anha was resting her chin on the shoulder of the Prophet ﷺ, and she was observing this performance. And the Prophet ﷺ was perfectly comfortable with her observing this performance. And we know that because we have a sunnah taqririyah, right, the sunnah of tacit approval, the Prophet ﷺ cannot allow anything prohibited to take place in his presence without pointing out, its prohibition. Imam Bukhari classifies in his tabweeb, in his, putting together the chapters of Jami' al-Sahih, he puts this hadith in the chapter Jawaz an-Nadar ila al-Ahbash wa man ashbahuhum, right? The permissibility of looking at darker skinned people, the permissibility of looking at Africans and those like them. because there is another hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in which Abdullah ibn Maktoum enters the home of the Prophet ﷺ. And of course, he was a man that was kafif al-basr. He was blind. He was blind. So when he came into the home, Aisha did not get behind the hijab. She did not move really. And the Prophet ﷺ gestured to her that, you should move. You should go back. You should conceal yourself. And she said, Ya Rasulullah, like he's blind. He can't see me anyway. And the Prophet said to her, alayhi salatu, well, are you blind? Meaning like you can see him. So still observe distance. Imam Bukhari is attempting to highlight or address the difference in the two approaches. This one man, Aisha, has to get behind a screen. This group of men are performing and she's perfectly okay watching them. And Bukhari clearly thinks that the difference here is because of their race or because of their phenotype, because of their physiognomy, how they look, right? Now, when I first read this, Tayssir, I was hot. I called Hamza Abdul Malik. I picked up the phone. I was steamed. I'm like, wait. Imam al-Bukhari just said I was ugly. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, yo, what is this? Right? Because I had known the riwayah, I had known the narration, but I hadn't known the chapter heading. Like the permissibility of looking at Africans, like, whoa, that's hardcore, right? Hamza said something to me that I will never forget for as long as I live. He said, wait, hold on. There's clearly the Imam thinks that the difference in the approach of the Prophet, peace be upon him, is the way they looked. It's clear that Bukhari thinks that this accounts for that difference in approach. But to go as far as to say that this is racism, that this is another example of darker skinned people being demeaned in the tradition. This is a critical example of where Black people, certain stereotypes about Black people have been promoted by the Islamic tradition. Hamza said to me, well, think about the following scenario. And this is really brilliant. And Hamza is a brilliant man, mashallah.
I agree.
He said, alhamdulillah, think about the following scenario. He said, if your daughters were watching like an old karate movie and everybody, in the frame was fighting and they were all Asian and everybody was fighting and, fighting and stuff. And then some of the characters began taking off their shirts, right? Just, it's a part of the scene, right? He said, you may or may not jump in front of the screen or insist that she change the channel. On the other hand, if she was watching some musical performance and Drake or Lil Wayne, like a rap artist, took off their shirts, you would maybe certainly jump in front of the television or insist that she change the channel. Is that necessarily because you think that those Asian actors are ugly or less worthy or anything like that? I said, no, none of that would be true. He said, then to suggest that Bukhari is highlighting a racial difference means that he's highlighting something unfavorable about Africans. That's a failure to use husn al-dhan. That's a failure to use to give one the benefit of the doubt. And we both looked and said, wow, someone looking critically at the tradition could take something like this and build an entire paradigm, on this hadith and many others, when there was a much more charitable way of looking at how Bukhari classified, this particular hadith and how the Prophet ﷺ engaged. And it just made me reflect on how dangerous it is. Yes, we can approach certain texts critically, but how important is it in our approach to this tradition to be charitable, to to morally enrich what we find? I mean, how does that dovetail with being critical?
Yeah, I think definitely, irrespective of any one example, I think that's part of the beauty of working within the tradition. I think one of the kind of huge mistakes that are made when one approaches the religion from without the tradition, meaning that they approach it from their own lens, whatever lens that might be, is that they're removing all of the kind of tools that protect from like enormous misunderstanding, right? Enormous, because the thing is, the tradition was built in a way to help try to get around those type of misunderstandings, right? That doesn't mean it always succeeds. I'm just saying that that's part of the whole process. Part of the process is to develop theories and axioms to really get to the heart of, well, what is revelation telling us, right? I mean, that's, at the end of the day, that's what the tradition is about, is trying to tell us, what is revelation telling us? How are we supposed to live? What are we supposed to believe? What type of people are we trying to become, right? That's what the point of the tradition is. It's giving us tools to approach those things. So when we engage it critically, that means that, we use our intellects, we use our context, we use our communities, and we go back and we say, okay, how are we supposed to live this religion? And we don't start from scratch, because again, there's no reason to start from scratch. There's no reason to ignore 1,400 years of people, blood, sweat, and tears of some of, the most intelligent people to ever walk the face of the earth, to just ignore it and start from scratch. That doesn't make any sense. We wouldn't do that in any discipline, right?
Of course.
So I think the critical part is to keep in mind that, for example, like you said, charitable readings are extremely important. I'll just give one example that I know very well. So it's well known that in Islamic intellectual history, certain theologians felt that specific philosophers, Ibn Sina, etc., had kind of overstepped, and that they were no longer Muslim because of certain things that they said, right? Certain beliefs that they had, really is more precise, okay? And for example, Imam al-Ghazali, it's well known, in his Tahafut al-Falasifa, he mentions, 3 very specific core beliefs that he feels that they've overstepped on. But what people forget is that was, first of all, number one, the rest of the beliefs, Imam al-Ghazali had tried very hard to show that even though I might not agree with them, they don't render one not Muslim. So that's step one. So he had tried very hard to kind of do that. Number two, to go to your point, the generations that came after Ghazali, did they just embrace what he said? They didn't. In fact, a number of them came back and said, how can we charitably read what, for example, Ibn Sina said in a way that maybe is not as distasteful to our understanding of the religion, what we believe is true, right? And so you had countless people do that. For example, I worked on a translation of Ibn Kamal Basha, who's an Ottoman scholar, who very specifically through essay after essay is trying to say, look, maybe that's not what they meant. Like, maybe this is what they meant. And so he's trying to be as charitable as he can, right? Again, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this charitable reading, but you see within the tradition itself a spirit of that. So I think that's one. Number two, I think the spiritual point that you're pointing to, like our own hearts, that's also very important. As we critique and as we engage and as we discuss, that we not lose sight from whatever angle we're coming from. It's very important that we don't, miss the whole point, that our hearts, if they kind of get off track, we don't want to argue the point at all costs, right? Such that we even render our own hearts, impure, right? So I think that also is very important. But one last thing, I do think that the people within the tradition, if they don't allow for a positive critical engagement, that is what's going to happen. People are going to say, forget it. right? If I have to take everything 100% exactly as it is, it's just not, it's not the way it's ever been. And on top of that, to add to the point, what you said, people are more literate now, they're more engaged now, they're more educated now. We have to give them back and forth with them. We have to.
No, we have to. I think the only difference between the reading of a scholar and the reading of a non-scholar, it's not even literacy. And yes, we can take for granted that there is a certain difference in familiarity with kind of the discourse as a whole, right? The scholar is going to be more familiar with kind of the life of the discourse, right? The literature broadly than the non-scholar. But I think the biggest difference is that the scholar is invested in protecting and preserving this enterprise. So certain approaches are going to be, like not even in the purview of consideration, because that would undermine the whole thing. Whereas I find that some of the, when I say, and they are scholars, but they don't have some of those traditional allegiances, right? They're much more willing to read the tradition in a way that renders it renders it incapable of providing guidance on modern issues, right? They're much more willing to, I guess, slash and burn, to say that this entire thing is compromised by racism, or this entire thing is compromised by misogyny, or this entire thing is compromised by classism, or this entire thing is compromised by heteronormativity, or this, right? And I think that, people that are insiders to the tradition are much less willing to do that, because they know this is the bridge, this is the link to worshiping God with integrity, if we are to stay connected to the way of the Prophet. And sometimes I think that it's just that investment that is the difference in those critical readings. We can both have critical readings, but you're probably not, if you believe in the efficacy and viability of the tradition, you're probably not going to read in a way that renders it untrustworthy or renders it useless. You're going to, read critically, but uphold the worthiness of the tradition. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And to start kind of where you started, I think there's a pretty well-known professor, American professor that teaches in Germany, Peter Adamson, who works on Islamic philosophy and philosophy in general. He has like a really famous podcast called History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. And so he focuses himself on Islam. So one of the things he does is he talks about taqlid. And he actually talks about
define taqlid.
Well, that's, I think, part of the issue. So taqlid can be seen as like blind following, like you blindly follow a scholar. That's one way to interpret it. But what Adamson tries to show is the importance of expertise in our area. He's not talking about just Muslims. He's talking about expertise in the world, right? The loss of expertise is something that's being written about a lot. But he talks about critical following of expertise. Okay, so think about it like this. If you come to see an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer, any expert in any field, you give some amount of what's the English word I'm looking for? Deference. Thank you. I'm forgetting my English, by the way, as I'm learning other languages. So you give a certain amount of deference to their expertise, right? However, is it total blind deference? It's never total blind deference, right? Rather, there's some amount that you have autonomy about whether I'm going to agree with this or not. If something starts to sound weird, you're like, wait a second, I need a second opinion in whatever field you're dealing with, right?
Absolutely.
So when it comes to Islamic scholarship, why would it be any different, right? There's expertise, but there's critical deference, right? We can't say there's no expertise. That also doesn't make any sense. That it doesn't matter if you don't even speak Arabic and you're going to tell me what the Quran says. Your mind doesn't make it doesn't process, right? Quran's in Arabic, right? So So there, I think there's a level of understanding the place of expertise. So that's one thing. The second thing that I'll harp on again, and I said this to you before, but I really think it's important. I do think there are extremes. However, I think the number of people that would do slash and burn type tactics with the tradition would decrease greatly if people within the tradition were more open to thinking about these things critically with people. I think the more open we are to talking about these things critically with people and engaging people as per the tradition itself, and has been for literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
That's right.
Then when you see people doing slash and burn, what will everyone else say? Come on, man. Look, they're being they're being extreme in their position. We don't have to think about it that way, right? But when people from within the tradition hold and refuse to engage critically, then people start getting upset and they start saying, you know what, why am I following this to begin with, right? There's no engagement with my concerns, right? So I think a key to this is that from within the tradition, within the traditional discourse, we allow for some amount of critique, some amount of engagement that works within the tradition. We look at new ideas, we engage new ideas. Then there will always be a group of people. Look, there's always going to be a little group of people that say, forget the tradition, right? Of course. What are you going to do? You're not going to, I'm not saying that they're Muslim too. They're trying to do what they believe is right. But I think if we have, as a tradition, as a traditional discourse, we have to be willing to open up the circle and to discuss new ideas, to discuss new theories, and to engage.
Oh, I mean, this is what we're all about at ALIM. I mean, just, for the record, we did not pay Tayssir to say any of this. But, this has been ALIM's approach, for about the last 20 years. Not saying that, kind of this democratization of interpretation can in any way, obviate the need for expertise, but that there's a critical engagement with expertise. You know what I'm saying? So we've been saying that for a long time. I wonder why that seems to fall on deaf ears. Why there tends to be people who either promote this hyper authoritarian notion of like the ahlul dhikr, fas'alu ahlul dhikri in kuntum la ta'lamun, right? Ask, Allah says, ask the people of dhikr if you don't know. And I know people that will insist that no, this is a Quranic reference to a group. There is a group of people. There's a group of people, and it's not simply about what they know, but it's about their spiritual standing as well. That these are the custodians of the tradition, and we must defer to them. And then you have people, at the opposite, extreme. It seems to me like this would be an easy place to strike a balance, but I think it's absolutely essential. But the problem is it's very hard work. It's not easy.
I mean, think about it. We're talking about not just a few critical questions. We're talking about entire fields of study and research that need to be energized, synthesized with, discussed. That's not a small task. Not one person's going to do it. No one person's going to come and they're going to save the day. Rather, we need think tanks, we need research institutions that are really taking this stuff seriously. They're bringing in top people in those fields to work together. And there's got to be that commitment. Like you said, there's a commitment to work with the tradition, right? Maybe we don't even have to say within. We work with the tradition. We're working with it, right? We're not discounting 1,400 years of Islamic scholarship, right? We're taking it into consideration. We're moving forward. I mean, I assume everyone who's Muslim is taking revelation as revelation, right? If they're a Muslim, that's where they're starting. It's from Allah, it's from the Prophet ﷺ, I take it. The question is interpretation. Or did the Prophet ﷺ say it or he didn't say it? That I understand is a place of back and forth. So for Muslims who accept anything the Prophet ﷺ said, when they're certain that he said it, or for Muslims that accept anything that's in the Quran because they're certain already that it's from Allah, then beyond that, how do we interpret, how do we talk about, how do we apply, is a place of conversation. So those who want to work with the tradition say, look, the tradition exists. Let's learn what the tradition has to say and let's engage these new ideas. And there is going to be a critical engagement. It isn't just the tradition already has all the answers, right? That's I think that's a mistake. It's not the right way, not the right way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, to the other side though, I mean, I think, you know, we're experiencing, you know, a moment that it would be easy to assume is unprecedented. Like, you know, there's nothing, and I think when people are forced to live this religion spontaneously, see, what I think emotionally a tradition provides people is stability, guidance. That, okay, I know I'm good as long as I'm staying within the confines of this kind of received tradition. I'm good. The minute I begin to venture outside of that, I become very uncomfortable. I become very uncertain about, you know, how I'm engaging my relationship with God. And I think that we have to fortify ourselves spiritually so that, you know, we are rooted enough in our devotion that attempting to live spontaneously within some of these furu', some of these branches, some of these secondary and tertiary questions, we don't feel that that is jeopardizing our Islam in any way. I think that even that conflation is, you know, it's like, you know, Abdul Hakim Murad said once that the new Shahada is there is no Islam but Islam, and Muhammad is the messenger of Islam. You know what I'm saying? Because in many ways, Islam has become an idol. You know, it's almost like, you know, there isn't this real encounter with the divine. No, my relationship with God is really contained within the orthodoxies of the tradition. And
I think
all we have.
I think the point that you're making this part I definitely agree with is the question of, you know, making it seem like it's an all or nothing package. Like everything's an all or nothing package. It's everything that every alim said you have to accept as right and true, or else you're not Muslim. You know, no person who studied the tradition thinks that. However, unfortunately, I think there's some defensiveness on the part of, because of, like you said, the moment that we're living in. There's some defensiveness. And I think we have to get past that defensiveness. The only way to get through this period in a healthy manner, intellectually, in my estimation, is that we engage it. And I don't think it's the first time that it's happened in history. Maybe not in the same way, right? But if you look at critical moments in history, in fact, one of the reasons I feel as strongly as I do about this is because looking at history, you can see it happen. You can see, for example, forces kind of pushing up against one another. There's conflict, there's tension. And then eventually what happens is some type of middle ground.
Some type of synthesis happens.
Yes.
You know, like Ash'arism, Maturidism, these are great traditions of synthesis, right? And this is, I'm going to say this, we're going to have to wrap up because we only have like an hour. I don't want to hold you longer than I can. But one of the places that I think we need to go is our tradition, I think, elevates the quotidian voice, the voice of the everyday person. And I think that one of the issues with hyper specialization is that you have a group of people who are clearly invested in the preservation of a certain intellectual tradition, but without interlocutors that come from just the regular world. Just like, what does this mean to you as someone that just worships God and is wholesome? You know, like those statements of Imam al-Haramain Juwayni and Ghazali, Tubtu ila din al-ajaiz. This isn't just, I've repented to the religion of, you know, old women. You know, I've turned, in their later years, I've turned to the religion of old women. I think it would be a complete disservice to the seriousness and the gravity of the moments that they were in to suggest that this was just flippant. No, there is much virtue in kind of the common, the people like me, the Muslims that worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without the pretense of, I won't call it pretense because I don't want to speak of it in a demeaning way, but that aren't dealing with some of these issues in as conspicuous a way. I think having their voices in the room enhances the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. I don't think you lose anything by saying we're going to include more people. I don't think you lose it. And there's always time to have very specific technical conversations, but you don't lose anything by asking other people that are not within, for example, that specific field, what they see in this conversation. And I think that kind of, you don't want to move in that direction that blocks other people off. In fact, I think that does the opposite of enriching. You know, I can't think of the word right now in English, but it is the opposite of enriching the conversation.
Mashallah. So I see we have some questions that, you know, folks online with us ask. Maybe you can, you know, pose some of those, because I can't see them, but I think you can see them.
Do you know what time this is supposed to run until? Because I thought it was until 4, but excuse me, your time is 8. What is it, 8 or 9?
Yeah. Oh, it's 8. It's 8. So I think this was supposed to, but if there's a way that we can kind of take the questions in just kind of a broad stroke.
Sure.
You know,
I didn't read all of them. Let me just take a quick look. I read that one. That one. Right. Okay, so you have some, I think, pretty distinct ones, but I'll try to say what comes to heart real quick. So in theory, I don't have a problem with saying that a scholar at some point in history made a mistake or said something that was morally wrong. I don't think that that's against the tradition to do that. It just depends on the context and whether one feels that they've reached the conclusion that that person made a mistake or that the person had done something morally wrong. In theory, as a question, I'm not talking about the specific situation because that needs to be studied on its own. But as a theoretical question, one of the questions is, why can't we just say something is problematic? Of course, I don't think that there's a problem with that, right? Because we're not talking about revelation, right? I mean, if you say that about revelation, that's a problem. But if you say that about ALIM, it's not the end of the world. In fact, they say that about each other. So it's not like that's off grounds, you know? The question of spirituality versus rationality, I think is a complicated question. I think it needs its own kind of conversation. I'll just give my opinion by saying the two are like a Venn diagram. I don't see them as being separate, and I don't see them as being exactly the same thing. And I think the more that we study about what the mind is, what the soul is, and come to better understand those things, we start to realize that they're not separate. Just like that the body and the soul, even though there might be two different creations, they're interconnected. And what we do with our body impacts our soul. So I think we don't want to pit them against one another. And that's happened throughout history, like rationality versus spirituality. But I think all of the greats of our tradition recognize that each has to be given its due. I think I'll leave the question of identity because it's a whole nother conversation. But I think I dealt with most of the other questions that were on there.
Jazakallah kulla khair, Akhim, and this was really enjoyable. It was a bit esoteric and a bit, you know, I mean, I'm talking to Tayssir, right? So, you know, it's going to be that way, and you are, you know, you're in it, you know. I mean, you're drowning in that literature. So it's good to just kind of listen to your thoughts on some of these issues, you know, pick your brain. I look forward to being able to do this again. Mashallah, pleasure was mine. This is really enjoyable. You know, I'm going to leave all of this Islamic studies stuff behind. I'm setting up for a career in media, as you all that stuff. I'm setting myself up to have a podcast, get some, you know, some advertisements, you know, for, all the brands that I like, you know what I'm saying? So no, I'm just kidding, but no, actually, I really appreciate you taking time out to do this. My best to you. If you talk to your sister Lena before I do, please give her my salam, inshallah. We're praying for your blessed mother.
Thank you.
Praying for your family. Be safe, inshallah.
You too, inshallah.
No political conversations in Turkey if you want to stay there. Sorry.
No, sorry.